Okay. Good afternoon, familia de clase y those online. My name is Sydney Gordon, and I'm a first-year master's student here in the Latin American Studies program, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Zephyr Frank. He's a gilded professor of Latin American Studies in the Stanford School of Sustainability, a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and professor courtesy of the Iberian and Latin American Cultures program here at Stanford. Dr. Frank is a historian in the Department of History as well, and he previously directed the Stanford Urban Studies program and has served as a visiting professor in Minas Gerais in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. He did his PhD at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and was the recipient of the Fulbright Hayes Doctoral Dissertation Fellowship to Brazil. Since 2019, he has served as a committee member on the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve Faculty Advisory Committee, a place that as class students recently got to visit. And while much of his work has focused on Brazil, today he will share with us about his research on land reform in Oaxaca, Mexico. Today's talk is entitled The Struggle for Land and Community, Oaxaca in the Age of Ejido. And some questions I got from reading the description is, what is the distinction between community property and private property? What are the communal impacts of land reform in Oaxaca over this century of struggle? And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Short and sweet. Thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to listening to it.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and also those excellent questions. Some aspects of which I hope I'll be able to answer, and others I think will be good food for thought going forward. So, okay, I plan to talk here for about 30 minutes and then turn things over to some of my co-authors on this paper that we're working on and that we're presenting you today. So again, I'm Zephyr Frank. I teach in the history department and in environmental behavioral science in the Moore School. And what I have prepared today is really a preliminary report, kind of at a midway point in a research project that has been percolating over many years in my mind. And I was very fortunate last year to have the opportunity to work with a pair of fantastic master's students here in CLAS, as well as with a PhD student from the history department on this research. And that really jump-started and the progress on the project, and makes it especially gratifying to be able to be here together with Daniel, one of my co-authors on this project, Annie, who is joining us from far, far away, and Nina, who I think is going to be trying to join us a little bit later. So this will be a slightly different presentation from other talks that I've given at CLAS. Usually it's just a solo talk and I talk for 45 minutes. This time I'll go first, but then I'm going to turn things over and allow my an opportunity for the co-authors to also contribute here to our presentation. Okay, so do I have slides?
Behind you.
I don't know whether people are going to be able to see very well or not, but I'm supposed to stay in the same spot. Okay. Okay, so the premise of this research is essentially to interrogate the historical background to the struggle for land, and specifically in the case of Oaxaca, during the 20th century. And the first step that I took in developing this project was I went back in time, back to when I was just starting out as a graduate student. I was at UCLA at that time, and I was studying with this professor named James Wilton. I don't know whether James Wilton's name rings any bells if anyone around here. And his claim to fame was he had written this book about the perhaps one of the most boring subjects imaginable, which was the federal budget in Mexico. It was just like a book about the federal budget, but it was actually an important work at that time, because it really tried to explain how the priorities of the Mexican state changed over time, and the distinction between the stated priorities or the rhetoric of various governments over the course of the 20th century versus what they actually did if you took the budget and where money was spent as a kind of fairly accurate proxy for what the government did, and then explored the kind of transformation over time of the Mexican federal government. And within that, there's this story of land reform, of course, which is probably familiar to most of you, but perhaps not all of you here today. The story of land reform is enmeshed with the story of the Mexican Revolution. In part, a very large kind of motivating force for the Mexican Revolution, in particular the agrarian component of the revolution, starting around 1910, running in its kind of most violent phase up to about 1920. This is the typical way that we periodize this. Of course, the Mexican Revolution can be construed as beginning a little earlier, and certainly the government, as it took power and then developed into a kind of one-party state, a post-revolutionary one-party state, had an idea of a kind of permanent revolution. The revolution was ongoing, it was incomplete, and it was the government's job to complete it. And in part of that process, if you bearing that in mind, knowing that there's a significant revolutionary move toward demands for justice in land. And this is coming, I would argue, largely from below. So Zapata is demanding land. It's not that, Huerta or Madero or whoever, is the person in charge in Mexico City is giving the land or is, motivated to pursue land reform. But this is coming from below. The revolution succeeds on some level. There's controversy about how successful it was, but I think there can be no doubt that the Constitution that emerged from the Mexican Revolution was a truly radical document, which included Article 27, and that's what governs land and rural land in particular. And so that's kind of the backdrop to the story. So but there's a problem that I perceived there's vast literature on land reform. As you can imagine, this is one of the most important aspects of the history of Mexico. It's also one of the most important stories of land reform ever in the history of land reform. So there are hundreds of books, thousands of articles. So it's impossible, I can't say with absolute certainty today that someone hasn't already made all of the points that I'm about to make in slightly different ways. But what I can say is that the dominant narrative has been this narrative, which is, graphs showing how much land was purportedly distributed by each president. So here's Cardenas, the president who was associated with the most number of people being benefited and also a large area of hectares distributed. So Cardenas, this is 1934 to 1940. So this narrative of, okay, you've got a revolution, there's a little bit of land reform going on, kind of dies out, all of a sudden Cardenas comes into power, boom, you have a massive land reform in the 30s, and then it tails off again, and then there's this kind of 1960s resurgence. And this story essentially depicts land reform as a top-down phenomenon. And it's just the way that these, graph like this, this kind of story. And this is what you would see if you read Sherman and Myers, like very popular, very well done in most respects, general textbook on Mexican history that like most undergraduates in the United States would be likely to read if they were to read a textbook in a class on the history of Mexico. There will be lots of graphs like this, and a lot of attention to the kind what is often directly referred to as the distribution of land by the president, or the president, of course, acting through agencies, the agrarian reform agencies, producing and distributing. So, of course, there's a big literature that inspires my work more directly, which has pointed out case after case where it's actually a lot different. Communities demand and seek access to land. They do it through different kinds of modalities, and this is something that my co-authors are going to talk about more at the end of our presentation. So there's clearly something more complicated going on. But part of the problem that I was facing, I think a lot of scholars face, is that of scale. So Mexico is a huge country. It's an incredibly diverse country. It contains, even within a state like Oaxaca, incredible diversity and size. And so, how do we formulate generalizable knowledge? How do we make claims about the struggle for land reform, its relationship to things that matter to us and to the communities in question? In my case, as an environmental scholar as well, I'm very interested in land use and forests and conservation, and that's something I'm going to talk about a bit today. So how do we construe an object of analysis that is both big enough to allow for some generalizations, for some general knowledge, so we're not just saying like, well, I know what happened in this one place in this one time, but I really can't say much about what, if anything, that tells me about someplace over here in a different. So we need scale, but we need it to be tractable. And so this project, basically, as I am based on a social science historian, uses sampling. So I say to myself, okay, there's way too many ejidos and comunidades in Oaxaca that I could ever possibly do any kind of in-depth historical research. So instead, I took a random sample of ejidos and comunidades within the state of Oaxaca. And so the red there, those are the sampled communities and ejidos. And that kind of gets me off to that's the scale that I feel like I can operate on. Well, that's the scale we could operate on, because it took the four of us working together for a year just to get as far as we've gotten to present to you today, preliminary results that are just one step on the way towards a final paper that we hope to publish. What did we find? So the ejido in Oaxaca is smaller in area. It has fewer households, and those households have access to about half as much hectares of land per household. And they seem to have been formalized on average a bit earlier than the comunidades, but the claims put forward, like the claim to land, excluding some outliers, and we can talk about that later. It'll come up, so you'll be able to ask questions. It's about the same. So that's the idea. We wanted to have a big enough universe of cases so that we could make statements about things like the average size and how much, whether or not people got more or less land depending on the modality of the form of the land tenure, the community property. And then we wanted to think about, okay, what are the kinds of bits of information that we can dig out of the archives about these communities and ejidos. So what we did was we tried to track down as many of the kind of founding the government documents, and we'll talk about that more. And I'm sure that folks will probably have questions about that as well. So we tracked down government documents relating to the points when the communities in question made claims to land, when they obtained titles to land, and the nature of those claims. And this turned out to be the most interesting aspect of the research. And this is what Danny and Annie are going to talk about in more depth, because it turns out that it's not a simple story where there's, one type of one reason and one reason only why communities come forward and try to claim land. There's not one process by which that land claim is adjudicated and ultimately approved. There's no clear pattern as to how long it takes, whether things will be approved quickly, whether it can drag on for a long period of time. So we'll be talking about, the complexity of the story. So we have a big enough, again, just to return to the kind of research design, which I hope will be reasonably convincing for most of you. We have a sample that's large enough, we're able to detect these differences, but we're also able to dig deep enough into the cases so that we can discover these things about the history of the struggle for land in the various communities within the sample. And this is different from what you'll find. If you read like a classic paper like Denninger and Minton have this paper in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, which is a very important paper. It compares deforestation in Oaxaca and Chiapas. It looks at both of them. It tries to predict it. It's a brilliant paper. It has zero historical depth. So everything is, the entire, it's a really good paper. I'm not criticizing them, but it's just that mode of analysis, because essentially they were operating with the kinds of things that social scientists, other than historians, like to use. Census documents, basically stuff that's already in a computer, and you can download the file and then you can run your regressions, which is great. But the problem there is there's this subterranean deep history that needs to be included, and that's what we're trying to do with this project. So I'm just going to run through here. So this is, you can see most of the claims cluster in the 20th century, as would be expected. This is the revolution, 1910, 1920, and then from there to about the 1960s, big cluster there. There are some claims that go back to the 16th century, so that's interesting and something we can talk a little bit about. One point I would make is that these communities, red is Ejido, blue is comunidad. This doesn't mean that these ejidos, that these communities didn't claim or didn't exist and didn't have a sense of claiming land, to the community back in some previous point. All this means is that they just don't say that in their documents. But it's interesting that some do, okay? How much area is associated with by household? So this is one thing that I wanted to test was, is it the case that if you have more households, you get more area? Is it kind of linear function? Not really. I mean, there is a relationship, but it's pretty weak. So yeah, you get more land when you have more households, but it's not like there's a formula here, which I thought was interesting. It was kind of like a way for us to check against something working in the background that would be explaining the differences between like how many hectares of land you get in an ejido versus in a comunidad, but it's not because the government says like ejidos get 20 and the comunidad gets 40. It's not like that. It's much more mixed. Okay, next step that I took was to look at historical and current evidence about land use. So it's one thing to get land. A community seeks title for land. What kind of land is this? Is it good for agriculture or not? How productive is it? Is it varied? Is it the kind of land that provides what you might say would be for ecosystem services that would be ideal for a community that wants to be able to live more or less autonomously, which is generally the concept here. These are rural communities that are supposed to be more or less self-sufficient, autonomous. That's the goal of the community. It's also the goal from the government's perspective generally with these programs. So and the land. So what kind of land do communities get? And so we can take historical and contemporary evidence to start to measure what is the quality of the land and what is the kind of land use that we can observe, and then we can think about how does that relate to the communities in question, and also allows us to compare them and to see which communities might be more successful or less successful on some other metric. When we think about conservation, forest conservation, things like that. So this is, I think, San Juan Celutepec, I believe. I have this written down somewhere. I should be more precise.
Yeah, it's
San Juan Celutepec. Yeah. So this is a relatively small community. It was claimed in 1936, and
No, you're fine.
it's really hard not to get
You're
up and
fine.
move around.
Yeah,
Can I
good.
move around?
Absolutely.
So here's the town. Here you see the fields. And you can see that in this case, this isn't like there's a, obvious natural borders per se, but you do see very different kinds of land use that might exist just across the border of this community. But it's basically a polygon drawn on top of the state of Oaxaca, delineating the space for this community. And then within it, we can ask what kind of land use is going on. So I used the 2020 land use survey data. So this is satellite data. And this is an aerial photo, which is nice because they're very detailed. And you can literally trace out each field and measure land use that way. This is showing us the same thing, but with the use of the land, the kind of brown color here. That's cropland. So you can, we can see that the satellite's pretty accurate. It's showing pretty much the same thing as those older photographs showed. And so, so then we wanted to just continue to dig into looking at these communities according to, for instance, households, how many households were in the community when it was founded. So a community with a lot of households, does that mean that it's going to have a lot of cropland or not? Turns out, yes, the bigger your community, the more cropland, which is totally not surprising. But it's not a super strong relationship. So there's a lot of variation. This is a theme that I'm going to keep coming back to as I kind of wrap up my preliminary presentation of the work here, is that what we found more than anything in this exercise was that it's really, really hard to come to develop the kind of simple, clean, nice sounding stories about land reform and the struggle for land, because these communities are extremely diverse and they have different histories, they have different agricultural systems. And, of course, if you take a big enough number of cases and you crunch the numbers, inevitably you're going to find things. And I'm going to show you one thing that we found doing that. But it really kind of, more than anything, and what we'll be talking about here as we move into the second phase of this talk, is that it's actually what was the most interesting thing to us was just coming to that realization that we weren't going to have an easy answer, or that it wasn't going to be, there's no hot take here. There's no one kind of master narrative. So some people don't like that, and it might be a challenge for us to get this published, depending on where we try to publish it. Founded early or late doesn't have anything to do with crop. Forest and cropland. Yeah, not really. I mean, there's a typology here. Like whenever you see the kind of weird distribution where it seems like there's like stuff clinging to the two axes and like kind of empty in the middle, there could be like a typology thing going on here. It's something we want to explore in the paper. That is, lots of crops, not a lot of forest, lots of forest, not a lot of crops. There's like different corners in this matrix that could be interesting. But, bottom line is it's like, more cropland definitely has some influence on forest cover, but it's not huge. It's not dominant. And I know people love to look at tables like this, so I included this just for those of you who love to look at them. And this is just kind of to give a first kind of modeling exercise. The dependent variable here is whether or not is forest cover. And so we're just saying, like, if forest cover is going to have a negative relationship with crop, so crop percent goes up, you decrease your forest cover. Urban percent goes up, you decrease your forest cover. And then, but altitude goes up, you just decrease it slightly, but it's not very significant. But here's the cool thing. So we were digging around, we're like, okay, but what about indigenous communities? And do indigenous communities potentially have different kind of relationship than other communities when it comes to the resources in the forest? And we had some reasons to think that this might be the case. There's other research that we could, we could talk about that comes to that conclusion. So that was a good intuition to test. And this is indigenous language. So speakers of an indigenous language, if that's greater than 25% of the population within the Ejido or the community, that was coded as a 1. So I just had a dummy variable there. But basically, changing from having a relatively low percentage to above that threshold has a significant and positive coefficient in relation to the amount of forest. These are just correlational, really. We're not saying that there's a causal story that we've fully worked out, but I know that I'm supposed to be wrapping up here soon. So I want to use this as an opportunity to kind of segue here. So we've talked about the big picture. First off, there's this incredible historical challenge, which is to explain land reform in Mexico, one of the most important episodes of land reform in world history. There's this dominant kind of way of looking at it as essentially a top-down process driven by charismatic or sometimes not so charismatic presidents, during their sexennios. There's this counter narrative that we've, and a really interesting literature that has emerged that definitely emphasizes the importance of the bottom-up process and the importance of communities themselves and seeking and obtaining and then managing land. We've done some preliminary kind of general statistical and eyeball metrical kind of work to think about what is the sample kind of telling us from that perspective. But it actually starts to get really cool when we start to look at what's kind of going on in the historical documents themselves. And so in particular, we're just going to be talking about issues like conservation, the degree to which that's embedded in these processes. And then also, Annie's going to be talking at the end about, what are some of the different kinds of reasons that are given for seeking land. So I'm going to skip that because I already kind of talked about it. And I'm very pleased to turn things over to my esteemed colleague. Oh, Annie, I think you have to go over there.
Okay.
We're not done.
Hi everyone, I'm just gonna quickly introduce myself again. So my name is Danny Medina. I just graduated actually in this program. So just a new alumni, as one would say. And I've been working on this project with Professor Zephyr and Annie, who's also a colleague from the masters. And as the professor mentioned, what we did was mostly focus on the archival research aspect of this project. So looking at the official land titling documents throughout the 20th century for each of the communities and ejidos that we sampled. So what we did was basically read through the documents and see what kind of information we were able to extract from those documents. And so one aspect in particular that I think is very interesting and that the professor has nodded to and that I will emphasize again is that there is no trend that can be said to what these documents say for various reasons. One of them being sometimes even the things that are mentioned in the document changes, so there's not a pattern. So the professor mentioned how some communities and ejidos mentioned the possession of land tracing back centuries, some of them don't. So that aspect makes it interesting because it's, as the professor has mentioned, very varied. So what we're going to focus on is here are some of the sort of specific kind of trends and some of the things that came up the most in some of the archives that we looked at. And one of them relates to forest conservation. So here is a screenshot of a paragraph of wording that was very similar in many of the ejidos that we looked at, in which the
Oh, sorry.
in which land conservation was deemed a public interest issue, and in which the communities are obliged to protect, restore, and propagate forests within the given territory. So this was something that came up in all of these are ejidos specifically. So in land titling for the ejidos in Oaxaca state, many of them had this sort of wording that nodded to forest conservation as an essential part of the titling of the land and sort of was passing the responsibility of this conservation to the community. So I think that points us to an interesting perspective and more subjective perspective of what is the relationship that these communities had with the land and the fact that something like land conservation that was being discussed so intricately to the fact that it was pointed to and nodded towards in the official titling of these ejidos. And so that was something that we thought was very interesting to highlight as something that came up in quite a few of the documents that we looked at. So that is a little bit of sort of the forest conservation aspect and how that was prominent. But I'm going to pass it on now to Annie, who's going to talk to us about some of the reasons why people were actually claiming the land and what was some of the preponderant reasons why that was happening. So Annie, if you're there.
I am. Thank you, Danny, for introducing our bit. Yeah, just really quickly about myself. I'm Annie and also just recently graduated from the master's. Oh, by the way, Danny, would you mind to keep sharing your screen? And I would just, thank you. I think that would be. Yeah, and just as a last note on that relationship between forest conservation and land use change, I think it's just really important to know that we have to keep this in mind, that it wasn't as simple as land was titled to communities and then all of a sudden everything was turned into agricultural land. A lot of the times land conservation, forest conservation was an important part of it. So this is a question that we were interested in. Is there any kind of relationship between land titling and then land use change? And just also a really interesting note is that actually all the ejidos that we looked at that mentioned forest conservation were, ejidos, no comunidades had that mention. So I think this is also something that we will look into deeper as we go on with the research. So yeah, we can see that there is a really deeply interlinked history of land use change, conservation, and land titling. However, to understand that, we really wanted to dig a bit deeper and understand where are the communities coming from? Why are they requesting land titling in the first place? And it was really interesting to see that across the examples that we looked at, they were rather similar in their language. And there were three main reasons why they requested it. And one was essentially conflict with neighboring communities, which is this slide. And essentially that was in all those cases where there was a neighboring community who was planting crops where they shouldn't, they were crossing borders. So one of the villages or comunidades, or sometimes also to turn to the authorities to establish formal titles and then settle that conflict. And it was interesting to see that a lot of times those conflicts were completely declared as settled, like in this case. They essentially got the official titles and they were like, no more conflict, it's all good. So yeah, that was one. The second reason on the next slide is communities requesting land to simply meet the basic needs. And this kind of really highlights also the nature of a lot of these communities who are mainly relying on subsistence agriculture, so essentially producing food for their own consumption. And for example, in this case, they simply asked for land titles so that they could live in gracia y justicia, so in grace and justice. So really communities simply wanting to have enough land to survive. And then the third reason is communities that had actually been possessing and working on those lands for time immemorial, tiempo inmemorial, was actually a phrase that was used a lot. And yeah, in these cases, they weren't requesting titling of a new piece of land. They were simply wanting to have official documentation for lands that were rightfully theirs. And a lot of times they were referring to really deep histories. Like, for example, in this case, desde tiempo inmemorial, nuestro poblado fue fundado por indígenas procedentes de Tuxtepec. So our village was founded by indigenous peoples who are descending from Tuxtepec, kind of really referring to, yeah, their deep ancestral claim. And I think that's really important to also keep in mind that it wasn't just no man's land that was being distributed. A lot of people actually had really deep ties to the lands they were living on. So yeah, also just on a last note, it's interesting to think about as well why communities were using such similar language. It could be that they did naturally just emerge with the same reasonings. It could also be that they were making use of laws or figuring out what kind of language authorities responded to. Again, something we need to look into deeper. And yeah, it was really interesting as we kept looking into the data, because even though the starting point was really similar, there were these three main reasons: conflicts, meeting basic needs, and requesting land that has been rightfully theirs for a long time. These communities actually took really different trajectories. So the land titling process was vastly different for each case. And this is a box plot with the data, excluding those that didn't have a date assigned to them. And it's really interesting to see that the median, which is just there under the line 10, that line, is at 8 years. So essentially the median is 50% of the data points are below it and 50% are above it. The median is right in the middle. So what we see that there is actually a big concentration of Ejido titling processes taking somewhere between 1 and 8 years. However, there's the other half, which is distributed over a much, much greater time, where it took, in a lot of cases, significantly longer. So that essentially pushes up the average, the median, to 40 years. And that's why the data is so skewed. And just kind of looking at the data, we found ourselves really curious. Why is it that in so many cases, the process was fairly smooth? Within a couple of years, they would get the land titles approved and just, yeah, keep moving and working the lands. And in other cases, it took up to 100 years for them to get their land titles. So now we're going to delve into a couple of case studies to show what we are looking at, which are non-representative, as both Danny and Zephyr highlighted. What we are finding is that it's very difficult to find one big conclusion, but hopefully we'll give some kind of insight into what we're thinking about.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. So for this case study, we're highlighting Santa Cruz Papalutla. And in this specific case, this was one that happened fairly quickly. So if we go there to the right, you will see the land titling request happened in 1951, and the actual land titling document was finalized in 1952. So over a year, a little under a year, or just a year. However, if we look at the previous states, it's interesting because it gives us a bit more detail as to what was actually happening and things that we've noted to throughout the presentation. So, for example, land possession of this land was mentioned in the document as going back to 1717. So it shows that, as we've mentioned, some of them include this sort of possession and mention of possession of land to way back than some other documents might highlight. So even though the process itself was very fast, when the official land titling request was made in the 20th century, we can see that maybe this, not only the occupying the land, but also using the land and requesting titling might have been happening for longer. And another thing which Annie just pointed to is that this document also mentioned that in 1905, there was a resolution of the conflict between neighboring communities. So another community neighboring Santa Cruz, Papalutla. And so what the document mentioned was essentially that, oh, the conflict was supposed to be solved, but it wasn't. So that's why the community is, again, requesting the land titling. So not only does that point us to one of the reasons why the communities were requesting land, which is to resolve the conflict, but also to the sort of aspect of this, an interesting aspect of this archival research which is not necessarily reflecting everything that might have been happening in the past in the actual document, or maybe just nodding to specific points, which makes it very interesting because it nods to the process being allegedly very fast, but in reality also shows that this process had been going on for longer, perhaps. So it's interesting to see how that plays out. And also, what we were concerned with and interested in, and we looked a little bit into, and we will talk about in a second, is the different entities that were participated in the land titling process. So in this specific case, the only mention of an entity that participated in the process is the Departamento Agrario, which is present in the majority, if not all, of the processes. But as Annie will touch on the second case, which took a lot longer to be resolved, some other entities were involved, and we were interested in seeing if that had a specific effect on the process being slower or faster. So Annie, I'm gonna go back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny. So that was a case that, even though it went quite deep, it was actually a fairly smooth process to get the land titling approved. Santa Catarina Ocotlan is one of the more difficult cases. It took a really long time, as you can see, between when they first claimed the land and asked for land titling and when they actually got them. So this is a community that requested the lands in 1918 for the first time, and their argument was that they didn't have enough lands to meet their basic agricultural needs. However, 1919, the authorities promptly rejected it and essentially argued that they weren't giving land titles because A, there wasn't enough suitable agricultural land, and B, there weren't any big properties around that could be expropriated. So this also speaks to the process of how the land titling happened. A lot of times it was just taking away lands from big owners of fincas or haciendas and then giving them to people who didn't have land. And yeah, this was then kind of laid to rest for 50 years and nothing really happened. And then in 1968, the community again came forward with land claims. And this time, it's interesting to see that the language they used has changed. So they were actually requesting titles to lands that they have been peacefully inhabiting for a long time. So essentially requesting official titles for what was rightfully theirs. And it was really interesting to see that in 1971, the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, and actually also the Dirección General de Bienes Comunales, which were both important agencies in this, as Danny will later touch on, supported the land claims. So they essentially said Santa Catarina Ocotlan should be given land claims. It is actually the right thing to do, and they have every right to it. And then in 1972, they indeed got the land titles. And of course, this is not clear conclusion that we can draw yet. It is just very interesting to see that there were all these other agencies involved in the process. And in a lot of the cases where it took a really long time for them to get their land titles approved, in some way, the Instituto Nacional Indigenista or the Dirección General de Bienes Comunales, etc., got involved. And I think this opens up some really exciting avenues for further research to really see what the role was of these agencies and whether they helped them get their land titles in any ways. And I think this is really exciting because it opens up the actors that we are looking at. So instead of just having the top-down approach that Zephyr was talking about earlier, or just having the bottom-up approach where it's just the communities, really recognizing all those that are in between, in the middle. So kind of having a much more holistic way of looking at it. And yeah, also I just want to say that this is a case study that's, of course, similar to many of the others, however, not the only reason why it took them longer to get land titles approved. But if anyone has any questions, we will gladly answer them in the Q&A section. And yeah, now we will just, to wrap up, quickly talk about some of the agencies that we found so far who have influenced the land titling process. Over to you, Danny.
Yeah, so this points us right in the direction of the discussion on the top-down versus bottom-up approach. So, you know, whether it was just the community requesting the land titling and then being faced with the institutions on the top, deciding whether they want to grant the land titling or not. But it's interesting to see that throughout the documents, we saw many different agencies acting in favor or intervening in the process of granting the land titling. And we were very interested to sort of detect and we want to explore more whether the fact that any of these agencies intervened made any difference in the process being slower or faster. And although we weren't able to specifically yet trace down a specific causal reason, we were able to pin down which ones were the main agencies that were involved. So first, we have Departamento Agrario. So the Departamento Agrario is basically the one that is involved in every single one of these processes. So whether or not it will have intervention from other agencies, the Departamento Agrario is always involved. And in the case that I was talking about, the first one, for example, in which ran really smoothly, Departamento Agrario was the only agency involved. However, as Annie mentioned, we saw that in the other case, we had Instituto Nacional Indigenista, or in other cases, Departamento de Asuntos Indígenas, so indigenous representing institutions acting in supporting these land claims and eventually making the process perhaps faster. And so this also connects to the context that we were talking about earlier on whether the historical processes that were happening with agrarian reform had any connection to the process of land titling being slower or faster, and the creation and action of these agencies from an institutional perspective had any influence on how land titling was being developed. And so then we have also Secretaría de Reforma Agraria acting in some of the cases to support the land claims or using agrarian reform law to back up the claims of the community and granting the land titling. And finally, we also have Dirección General de Bienes Comunales acting in the process as well. So it's interesting, again, to see how all of these different agencies and their interaction and intervention in these processes had an impact and their absence before on how the process was being developed. So I think that's all I'm going to say about this at this point. I don't know, Annie, if you want to comment on anything about this specific part before I pass it on to Professor Zephyr again.
Yeah, we should probably, we should probably conclude soon, right? Okay, I'll just go ahead. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Annie. Also, want to thank Nina, another co-contributor to this project, was off doing research in Brazil, and but is here joining us today as well, and is going to be part of the team writing this paper. So thanks to you all, thanks to everyone in the audience. We'll go ahead and conclude there. You've got an idea now of what our research aims to achieve. We're trying to approach this question in a fresh way by expanding the universe of cases to a large enough number that we can make some generalizations, and at the same time keeping it small enough and so that we can dig in and discover these fascinating historical elements and tell a richer and more accurate story. So questions, even better, like suggestions. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm not a student. I'm visiting. I come from the Galapagos Islands, and it seems to me like this is sort of the general thing that had happened throughout South America. And once the land was given back to people, what is the projection from then on, or what was the projection from then on? How is it going to benefit people now, from now on, onwards towards the future?
Excellent question. So I think that that's changed over time in Mexico for sure. Originally, the bottom up forces meant that it was very much focused on community autonomy and subsistence. So a lot of the land reform decisions in terms of like how much area would be granted, how many households, constitute a community, those were driven by a kind of, and so obviously, in 1920, what is considered an adequate standard of life, what is considered adequate resources, what is considered subsistence, that's, clearly in 2023, that's not going to be okay, right? Like you can't have people having the same resource. So things have changed in terms of what is the expectation that the community, the communal land, or in the case of the Ejido, where you could have an individual plot, but it would be governed by the Ejido, and essentially, in order to maintain possession, usufruct of the land, you had to farm, you had to use it. That's actually, and that's another last part of my answer to your question would be that I think it would, that in this case, land reform was really also in part an attempt to preserve rural communities, to prevent them from being dissolved or obliterated either by large landholders who could, enclose the land into private domains. But the fact that you had to, up until the reforms, controversial reforms of the 90s, you had to actually farm the land. And so we find plenty of examples where ejidatarios are kicked out for failing to farm the land for 2 years, like consecutively. So it had this, ultimately there's a kind of strange, almost like trying to not only to preserve the rural world, but kind of keeping people in the rural world. And, maybe at a certain point it becomes, it maybe means something different in terms of, is that really for the well-being of this community, or maybe better off moving, possibly, right?
Thank you.
Other questions or suggestions? Yeah.
Regarding like the forests and like cropland relationship you guys are trying to analyze, like, did you guys find that like some of these communities were like doing like agroforestry or like foraging or like using the forests as like agricultural plots, and thus that kind of like complicates whether or not like, oh, like can these forests also be understood as like agricultural land use?
That's a great question. We don't have that information yet, but there have been some papers that I've seen that do talk about that, agroforestry. And so I think, I mean, that'll definitely make for a richer story, make it a bit of less of a kind of either or Like the classic, you can either have crops or you can have forests. I just went to a seminar talk yesterday in the Door School, and it was all about that. It's like, you can have more forest or you can have more cattle, but you can't have both, that's probably true, but I think that's a good question. So, sorry, we can't answer that with the data that we have right now, but it's conceivable that whatever answer we might be able to give you in, a year from now would be stronger, more valid, because it wouldn't be just one case, I mean, this is a central problem for making scientific research, meaningful, right? You have to be able to put it in the universe of other cases. Other questions? That was a good one. So first up here, yeah, in the back, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. Good to see you, Annie, over there and getting engaged in this research. And it was a research assistant of mine a few terms back. My question is how many of the claims have included the concept of nature conservation, particularly where communities in Mexico are related to ancestral or indigenous background? If you have found some of those elements included in the claims of the land back to them, this is our land, ancestral land. We do feel connected to it, and we also want to protect the waterways, those aspects of nature that is part of their own being. So I'm just wondering if I did notice that some of the norms are really obliging the landowners or the community owners to protect those, but I was wondering if there was some aspects included in the claims that they from the community included as part of the concept of claiming that land back. Yeah,
that's an excellent question, and I can't answer it right now. I think my intuition is, so since we know certain things, we know that the language about conservation attached to the Ejidos, but not to the comunidades. So that's one bit of information. We know that the Ejidos overall do tend to have more of a indigenous community or component of the community. Although it's not an absolute, I mean, it varies a lot. And we know that language, originated in the cauldron of the revolution, and you can see, land, water, air being referred to in those foundational documents. And then it becomes part of the discourse of the state. So I guess I can't answer your question. I think that we probably would need a different sample, or we would need to look at like a large enough number, I think, of cases, because my impression is we'd probably be able to come up with one or two examples. I don't know, Danny or Annie, do you all have one in mind that you can put forward? I can't think of one right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is such an important question, and yeah, as we said, it's kind of a very limited data that we are looking at, in that sense that the requests that the communities are putting in don't always talk about the full picture. So actually, none of the cases that we looked at, the communities themselves said, oh, we would like to protect the lands, and that was something that was kind of coming from them in the documents. It was usually something that was like top down. So whenever they were talking about conservation, it was the authorities being like, the community must oblige and conserve the forests. And in the documents that we looked at least, the archival documents, there was no case of really a community coming forward and emphasizing conservation. However, just the fact that it's not mentioned in those documents doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's actually very likely that a lot of these comunidades and ejidos, of course, the people were stewarding the land and they were taking care of the land. And I'm fairly certain that if we look into more diverse documents, we will find evidence of that. In the archival documents that we have, there isn't much mention of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I really found it interesting how the language was similar in the documents, and I was wondering if during that time the Mexican Constitution said anything about, in order to make these requests, you have to have certain proof about, that the land was settled in certain dates or something that kind of made all the documents similar in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see that it operates on multiple levels, and then the part that we're still trying to figure out is the role of these intermediate institutions, which also have their own, discourses. So there's like the script. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, but that's a complicated thing, right? Because just because, the centers of power produce a discourse that has a script that like the subaltern has to mimic that script in order to be heard, doesn't mean that they're just being like interpolated by the powers that be, and that this isn't actually like the legitimate, rational and like cultural response that's being produced. So yeah, it does have that effect. That is to say that the Constitution, the discourse of the Mexican state more generally, the various entities that we've enumerated that are important in determining whether or not land titling is approved, all of that does, I think, have a decisive effect on the language of requests. That being said, there's enough variation so that they're not formulaic. So therefore, you can kind of intuit that in the different cases, different communities or ejidos are kind of taking slightly different approaches. And then maybe we can reason back from there to think about the different kinds of complex reasons that go beyond like, okay, here's a menu of options. I have to pick one of these. I can't come forward, coming forward and saying, we want this land because we know how to steward the land. We know how to conserve the land. We know how to live on the land. If that's not an option, that could be why we don't see it. So, but good, very good question. I mean, it keeps me up at night thinking about like stuff like that, because it definitely introduces like I don't know, it determines things in a way that complicates the kind of story I actually want to tell. But so it goes.
What kind of story do you want to?
No, I would prefer that the communities are acting on, generating their own discourse, or like they actually want to, land for the reasons that they give, as opposed to having to be essentially picking strategically picking like the least bad option in the menu of so I don't know, is there like I'm happy to answer more questions, but I
We
don't
can
know.
probably shut the
The
show,
thing, okay,
and then we'll just stay here
okay.
in the room with Annie, of course. Do you want?
I have a question, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, no, we're gonna stay.
Yeah, we're gonna stay.
Yeah,
There's a question in the back.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
The live stream's done.
Thank you.
So we probably just goodbye to our audience in the virtual world, and we stay here.
Okay.